Yeah, man, it's great to meet you. I'm looking forward to getting into talking about your debut, Aloft. But before we do that, I know we're all getting tired of talking about COVID, but it was such a momentous thing for all of us in so many ways. How did you survive as a musician through that time period? And how did it either influence this album or the way that you do things now?
It was a pretty depressing time, as you can imagine, as a professional musician, especially one like me who I was used to touring a lot. I was on the road a lot before COVID, both as a jazz artist, sort of under my own name, or just playing gigs with other people. And I work a lot in the singer-songwriter world as well. So I was touring a bunch before COVID, and that obviously the rug kind of got pulled out from underneath us. So in terms of survival, I was lucky. My wife and I, my wife kept her job, so she was working all through COVID, and I was able to. I pivoted quickly and was doing a bunch of teaching online. So I have a experience as a pedagogue as well. That's why I'm here at Interlochen Academy. But I was able to shift and do a lot of teaching online. And, I tried to just keep the lights on by doing little recording projects that people wanted me to do. I was recording from home a little bit, although not enough to really make it all make sense or pencil out in the end. You have to invest a bunch in a bunch of equipment to get the recording thing up and running. And then obviously everyone was doing that as well. So, why would they go to me when they could go to anyone else? You know what I mean? But it was certainly a challenging time from an artistic standpoint as well. I remember just feeling super, super depressed for a long time. So I wouldn't say that this informed that COVID necessarily informed the album so much. I guess I did have a little bit more time to practice and to write a little bit, but honestly, the tunes kind of came up after COVID in a way, so COVID, I wouldn't, I was jealous of all these other musicians too, who felt so motivated during that time. And I felt like it was like this really like fecund, super inspirational time for a lot of people who really, really worked a lot on their own thing. And I just felt so sad about the whole thing. I had a hard time feeling either motivated or inspired to really get a bunch of stuff together. I did work and I did practice, but I didn't. It wasn't like this renaissance like a lot of artists seem to experience when they had all this time to themselves. I just felt like it was that was really tough. It was a tough time artistically for me.
So, talk to me about this album. How did you artistically put this one together? What was the vision, and how does it feel on a visceral level as a debut to have this out?
It what I because I had all these records out before as a leader. I have a couple of duo records out with Lage Lund, the guitarist, and I have a quartet record that came out with Seamus Blake and Jonathan Blake on drums and Orlando LaFleming on bass. And before that, I had a couple of other quartet records. Um, I thought that it was time to finally do a trio. I think every pianist at some point has to make a piano trio album, and it's such a big and kind of overwhelming history and legacy of great performers and great musicians who have made their mark on the trio format. I guess I had been kind of putting it off for a little while, like waiting until I felt like A, I was ready, or B, until I had the music together or the group together that I really wanted to record with. And so I just kind of felt like it was time, it was time to put something out, to put my stamp on the trio format. And yeah, I've been pleased with the results. I mean, what I'll say is that I was very lucky to have the two musicians who are really in my corner on this record, and that's Matt Penman on bass and Quincy Davis on drums. Um, both musicians with whom I have a really long association from my time in New York. I was in New York from 2001 to 2016, so that's where I met both of those guys, and we had never played as a trio before I put together this record date. It was pretty old school in a way because I just booked a gig I knew I wanted to make the record. I had the music organized. I knew who I wanted to be on the record, and I just booked a gig at Mesro in New York, which is kind of like my favorite place to play. I booked a gig there and then booked a recording session the next day. So we got we rehearsed once that afternoon in New York. We played at Mesro that night, and then the next day we recorded that album, and that's what you hear on this record.
So ultimately, what are you hoping the listener gets from this album?
I hope they get, well, I mean, I hope they dig the music, first of all, and I hope that they like the sound of the instruments and the sound of the instruments combined together. I mean, that sounds just like a simplistic thing to say, but really that's what I'm hoping for. And I hope they get a good introduction to me as a sort of trio conceptualist, as a composer, and as a leader and I think it's a fairly modern, straight ahead record. So there should be some good points of entry for even the most kind of casual jazz listener, I think. Um, but there are some tunes on there that I wrote that I'm really pleased with, and some arrangements that I came up with that I really dug. So yeah, I mean, I hope that people like the music, and I hope that in some way, although it's hard to like carve one's way as a musician through the endless amounts of things that are being put out these days. I hope it can put me on the map a little bit as a trio artist, not just as a band leader in a quartet or as a duo player, but someone who leads a trio and knows how to do that.
Well, and that's the thing. You've been around for a while. You've done a lot of work. You're very
Yeah,
established. How did this all begin? Take me back to where you were born and raised. And
sure.
what were the seeds of music and more specifically jazz that has evolved into your career and who you are today?
Yeah, so I'm Canadian. I grew up right in the middle of the country in a city called Winnipeg, small city called Winnipeg, basically straight north of the border of North Dakota and Minnesota. So it's kind of it's kind of the Canadian Midwest in a way, and it's a very, very cold place. But it's actually it's a surprisingly cultural place given its isolation. It has a world-class ballet company, it has a great symphony orchestra, and it has a lot of pretty good jazz players, and it has a jazz program there at the University of Manitoba, which didn't really exist when I was growing up. But how I got into it, I mean, my grandmother had been married to my grandfather who passed away, who was an amateur trumpet player and he was a photographer and journalist. They both worked at a local newspaper. So I never got to meet him, but I did get to hear his record collection through hanging out with my grandmother, my grandma Peggy. That was my dad's mom. So she had all these records out, and so I was kind of like, even without knowing, being able to identify any of it, I was kind of familiar with some of the names and some of the sounds a little bit, And then I think as a young teenager, I got really into the Police, the band The Police, and then from that, I got into like the music of Sting, and his first couple solo records had just come out, Dream of the Blue Turtles and Nothing Like the Sun, and of course that those had like Branford Marsalis on them and Kenny Kirkland on piano, so they had this kind of like jazz angle. So just from reading the liner notes of those records, I bought some Branford Marsalis records, and I really got into those, and then from reading those liner notes, I was like, he would mention John Coltrane or Miles Davis or, Thelonious Monk. So I started buying cassette tapes at the local record store of like whatever I could find in Winnipeg. There wasn't like a huge, wide collection of jazz like there is available now. So I was buying these cassette tapes and kind of listening to those, and I just kind of got the bug at a pretty young age. By 13, 14, 15, I was listening to a lot of jazz, and then I had started taking piano lessons relatively late, around 12. So then I started kind of trying to figure out how to play some of that on the piano. And ultimately, I went to school for it. I got a music degree at McGill, which is a great music university in Montreal. So that's kind of my entry into the jazz music. I had a little bit of exposure like from my grandma, and then also just from my own listening. I kind of got lucky, and I feel like that's how a lot of people get into it too. They find some way into it, and it can be a pretty indirect way sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. And I think also like some of those records when I first put them on, I couldn't make any sense of them at all.
Yeah.
And then later, as I came to understand what was going on a little bit more, then the whole world of that music kind of opened up for me, and that was really, really interesting.
It is crazy how many people out there may not realize how jazz influenced the Police were, because
Yeah,
that was kind of the edge at that point, what their sound. That's why it came out so stark at that point, especially in the early 80s when all these bands were coming out. No one
Yeah.
sounded like them. I mean, a lot of bands can never duplicate that sound again.
No.
But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and like the way that those they were all influenced by jazz music for sure, in addition to other things, but like definitely they were all influenced by jazz, and there was a lot of those sounds that I kind of got into. And then I think Sting pivoted even more and kind of got even more into it on those first couple solo records. There were long solos and yeah, it was really interesting to me. And to have Branford on those records, like kind of for a pop star at the apex of his career, to have a jazz musician like
right,
that on those records, I mean, that's a pretty bold decision in a sense. And
certainly.
to me, I love those albums. And like I said, it was such a gateway into my own listening into jazz music.
So take me back to the very first live jazz show you saw, and the first one that blew you away. What was that like?
Gosh, it's hard to pinpoint like what my very first one was, but I do remember. Have you heard of the Canadian guitarist Ed Bickert?
Oh yeah,
Yeah. So I went to, I mean, he's speaking of understated and under
yeah,
the radar.
uh-huh.
Here's a guy who like he was quiet to the point of being like almost like monk-like, and he played so quietly. Anyway, my dad knew about Ed Bickert and he came through Winnipeg and I went to go here and I didn't really, I had never maybe I've been to like one or two jazz concerts, but never something kind of at that caliber. And it was Ed playing with the local rhythm section of Winnipeg guys. And I remember thinking like that was just so cool that these musicians could get together, that there probably wasn't much of a rehearsal. He was like probably flew in and they might have played this afternoon, and seeing the music that they made that evening just together, just these three musicians speaking this common language, that was really illuminating to me. And I feel like that kind of opened up some possibilities for me as a musician. And then like come to find out later, I didn't really know anything about Ed Baker, but then of course came to find out later that he was, had played in Paul Desmond's group and had done all this amazing stuff. And um, I became a massive fan of his, and I still am. I love his playing so much. I mean, unfortunately, he passed, but I got to see him a lot when I was a young musician. But that show in particular, that definitely sticks out. And it's funny. Someone asked me about this last night. One of my students asked me about like what was a show that stuck with you early on, and there was another early one in high school where I saw Branford Marsalis's quartet,
Yeah.
and I had, like I said, I had been really into those records, like Crazy People Music and Random Abstract, those ones that came out in the early '90s, perhaps the late '80s. And that group came through Winnipeg, and they headlined the Winnipeg Jazz Festival, which at that time was really in its nascency. And I remember just I had never seen anything like that. That was like, seeing for me as like a teenager, that was like seeing a pop star kind of come out on stage, because I knew those records and I was so excited about that. So that was very moving for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you
Mm.
mentioned Pop Star. The very first, one of the biggest shows I saw when I was a kid, I saw the Michael Jackson 5 tour.
Oh,
And
cool. Wow.
and they were like an hour late, but Michael came out of a little hole in the ground, or in the stage, I should say.
Yeah.
I didn't mean it to sound that
Yeah. Yeah.
aggro, but that sequin glove came out and the most powerful light in the world was shining on it, and it
Oh,
just
yeah.
dazzled the whole crowd. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's something. And yeah, Ed's kind of like Todd, man. Like he
Yeah.
had such a sway over the world of musicians and fans that knew him, that you were just totally blown away. There was a drummer in Kansas City. I don't know if you ever knew his name was Tommy Ruskin.
Hmm.
And one of the first times that I ever got really hooked on jazz, I used to go down into the basement of an old place that Tom Pendergast, who was in charge of Prohibition, of having alcohol flowing during Prohibition in Kansas City.
Okay.
He was Boss Tom. He was a mafia guy. And this was where he used to hang out in the basement. They play, to this day, they have a piano trio, and Bram Wienans was on the piano, and Tommy was a veteran drummer. And Bram used to come over and have bottles, and he would play them, and it was just hypnotic. And I always thought when I'd watch Tommy, how is this guy just in this basement of this club in Kansas City? Come to find out after he passed, and I dug into his life, Stan Getz offered him a gig to be in his band to go to New York, but he loved Kansas City, loved the economics and the comfort
Wow.
he had, and he was a family guy. he didn't do it. But it's those little moments where the doors either slide closed or
Yeah,
slide open where you can hop on or off and you just never know, you know?
totally, totally. That is so interesting. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that was one of the most interesting things about living in New York, those kind of happenstance types of things that you're talking about, you know, because any given night you could go out and hear somebody or be heard by somebody, and that could be your opportunity to get to play with, you know, with a to kind of level up as a player and play with some different people, and that was illuminating as a jazz musician to be around those kinds of possibilities. But just to circle back to what you were saying before too, I think I've always been drawn to those like players like Ed Bickert and well, and Todd, you know, like people who are kind of musicians, you know.
Yeah.
Like I think of like someone like Hank Jones or where where the it's very understated, you know, and in fact, there's a song on my record called Steen's Scene, which is about a Portland drummer named Ron Steen, who is himself very, very understated, very quiet kind of player. And I've always been drawn to those musicians, you know, not necessarily the ones who are maybe it's the Canadian in me. Maybe I'm like like a little more like understated or, you know, too polite or something. But I've always been drawn to players who sound that way and just who kind of operate that way in the world. So I like that.
So, speaking of veteran players, legends,
Mm.
luminaries, what have you gleaned from being around that caliber of player throughout your career that
Mm.
you've taken from them, either by osmosis or directly, and funneled back to your students? What do you give the youth based on your experience?
Oh my gosh. I mean, such a huge question. I feel like, you know, in this music, it's really, uh, I've always been really fortunate to be mentored or influenced by older players. You know, even from a young age, I got some good opportunities just to play with older cats. Like when I was first in Montreal, um, and I was like 17 or 18, I got to play with older musicians in Montreal because I could kind of play, and I think they could see something in me, and so they would hire me for things, and I would learn so much from that. You know, there's so much that you can learn just on the bandstand, including by like really sounding horrible on the bandstand, and no one really has to tell you that you're not cutting it. You know what I mean? But you can glean that you need to like go home and do your homework on a tune that you didn't know, you know, or you know, on a tempo that you couldn't deal with. So I always, I mean, those lessons are like kind of the most valuable. And also I have a deep respect for those players who have just been at it for a long time. I got to play quite a lot with in Portland with Chuck Israels. I don't know if you know who Chuck Israels is,
Oh,
but
yeah.
you know, bassist for Bill Evans after Scott LaFaro on a handful of really great records. Some of my favorite Bill records, and you know, he's on a record with Herbie Hancock. He's on a record with John Coltrane and Cecil Taylor. That's a really wacky record called Coltrane Time, and you know, he's just played with everybody, and I would just even apart from learning on the bandstand with him, every time I would ask him a question, he would have some sort of story about any musician that I could think of. You know, he played with Bud Powell in Paris for a little while. You know, it's like for me having a direct line to people who are part of that lineage is super important. You know, not like I necessarily consider myself part of that lineage, but it's nice to have played with those people and to get those real lessons about how the music really was back then when it was being developed, you know, when the language was being kind of made up by these great jazz masters. And, you know, now in jazz education, we're in a different kind of situation because you know, I try to impart as much as I can about my personal experience as a musician to the young students that I work with because I feel like that's, you know, as valuable as whatever skills we can kind of teach them in the classroom or in a combo room or whatever. But I think this is a music you really can't, you know, you can't learn it in a classroom.
Yeah.
You can't do it in a test tube. You have to be out there doing it. You have to be out there playing it with other musicians. And as great a student as you can be, it doesn't necessarily prepare you to be a good musician. So those are some of the things that I try to share with my students, you know, that there's no substitute for experience. And in particular, there's no substitute for the experience of playing with musicians who are way better than you and far more experienced. And I still try to seek that out, you know. as much as I have experience at high level in the jazz world, there's people out there who play circles around me, and I will gladly acknowledge that. And rather than being sort of intimidated by that, I'm drawn to those players. I want to learn from them, you know.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, what do you like the best about being a professional musician? What gets you up every day? What's the motivator?
Oh, it's definitely the money.
Oh, the best answer ever, man.
Yeah, it's it's kind of a get rich quick scheme. So I guess that's kind of the best thing, you know. No, I mean, obviously, it's extremely rewarding to get to play. The fellowship and the sort of sense of community that comes from playing with other great musicians is there's no real substitute for that for me, you know. So for me, getting to play with sometimes with some of my heroes, or even just with people that I'm really close with, where I feel like we have a shared language, or a common aesthetic, or a shared outlook about the music. Those moments, when things are really gelling on the bandstand and things feel right, and especially if someone's playing my music, like something that I made up, and we're playing it, and it just sounds better than I could have imagined. Like when I get to play with Quincy and Matt, that's how I feel. um, that's obviously my favorite part about being a musician. Just those moments, and also just the lifelong kind of sense of wonder and excitement that comes from being exposed to this great art form, this great American art form, and to be a small part of it feels very, very gratifying to me.
So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, students, but you run the show. What's
Mm-hmm.
your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Well,
Therapy hour.
you mean in terms of like what kind of musician am I?
No, I mean it's everybody has this idea of who they think you are. You play a role in their lives. You emit
Yeah,
this vibe with everybody, whether it's someone listening to your album or someone that's staying in the classroom, your family, everybody
yeah,
that knows you. But you ultimately run the show. What's your
yeah.
perception of what you're emitting to the world?
Gosh, I mean, I'm just trying to be a good person. I try to be a good husband. I try to be a really good father. I try to be a loyal and available friend to my great group of friends who are, kind of all over the world now. Musicians that I came up with in New York are now kind of scattered all over the globe, and I try to stay in touch with them. So I try to be very, very I try to be a very steadfast and loyal friend to them, and I try to be a very professional musician. I try to always be as prepared as I can for any musical situation I'm in, and I'm trying and learning to be a good music educator and hopefully mentor to some of my young students. So I guess I'm trying to do all of those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
totally does.
Okay.
So let me ask you this. If anyone wants to pick up a copy of your trio debut with Aloft
Yeah.
or catch you live, anything you've done before, where's the best place for them to go to benefit you the most?
Well, just listen to it online. It's up on all this wherever you stream music. It's available, and share it, and add it to your playlists if you want. That would be great. It is available. I have a very, very limited number of physical CDs. I only made really a handful, kind of mostly for promo, but I do have a very limited number of physical CDs, and I'm selling those through Bandcamp. So those, if you want to click on my Bandcamp link, that's great. But otherwise, just listen to the music. I mean, I there are some videos on YouTube of the trio, some very high quality um, videos from the recording session. So there's a couple of those out. There's one for the title track Aloft, and then there's one for track one of the album, which is called Let's Agree That You Agree With Me. So there are some videos on YouTube. You could also, if you were interested, go to the Smalls and Mesro archive, and there are lots of there's a big archive of performances of everybody there, but you can search for mine in particular if you're interested to hear more things like that. And yeah, I at the moment I don't have really anything coming up with that trio because I just started this new gig at Interlochen, and I've been so just trying to find my footing here. I haven't been really focused on playing live too much, but I did just do a gig at the Montebello Jazz Festival in Portland, which I just left, the city that I just moved from. So we did a gig on Saturday night, just on August 31st, I guess it was, and I think that will be up also soon, perhaps on the Montebello Jazz website. There was some video from that show as well.
Excellent.
So yeah, there's lots of, and you know, if and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and all the socials. So if people want to reach out, I'm always very glad to hear from people who are listening to my music and have comments or questions, you know. And I have a website, of course, but yeah, just feel free to you could just tell any of your listeners to reach out. I'm always glad to hear uh, from anyone who has questions or just wants to say they dug it, or you know, maybe they didn't like it. I'm maybe less interested in hearing from people like that, but
Right.
but I don't, you know, I don't mind accepting criticism. I know it's not perfect, so it's fine. But I think it's such, you know, in the jazz world, it's such a small community of people, you know, and the fan base, which tends to be an educated fan base, we have to do everything we can to try to reach out to them, you know, especially now that, you know, that, like I was saying earlier in our conversation, there's just so much stuff out there. How do you cut through? You know,
Yeah.
how do you cut through to the listeners who are going to dig the music? It can be a hard thing to do, but I'm always glad to hear from anyone with whom the music resonates.
Great to meet you, man. Thank you for taking a minute out to talk about the album and your life and music. I appreciate
My
it.
sincere pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you.
Yes, it was wonderful.